The notification appeared on Detective Amy Rodriguez's computer screen at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a gray, windless Thursday in March 2024. It was the kind of afternoon that felt suspended between hours, where time moved sluggishly beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. After 18 years working cold cases for the Illinois State Police, Amy had developed a sixth sense for these moments, the quiet, heavy ones that seemed to arrive before the mind fully grasped their meaning. Her eyes scanned the subject line, then froze. The Cody's match had been sitting in her inbox for barely 3 minutes, but the case number struck a deep, familiar chord. Henderson, Sarah Michelle, missing since September 12, 1968. File last updated 2019. Amy leaned back slowly in her chair. The office was still except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the distant tapping of keyboards from other detectives. Shadows from the manila folders strewn across her desk carved sharp lines across her face. She had handled countless cases that reached decades into the past, but 56 years, this was different. 1968 belonged to another world, one that existed before DNA meant anything to law enforcement. Back then, genetic science was still something whispered about in university halls, more curiosity of biologists than a tool for justice. The double helix had been mapped, yes, but the idea that invisible strands of code could one day solve murders was as fantastic as time travel. Yet here it was, proof glowing on her monitor. A perfect match. Thomas James Carlyle. His DNA aligned with evidence recovered from a torn sweater belonging to 16-year-old Sarah Henderson, collected in a small farming town in rural Millbrook, Illinois, over half a century ago. Amy frowned, reading it again. The match shouldn't have been possible. Carlyle had died 6 years ago, in 2018. His saliva sample, taken during a domestic violence arrest in Kane County, had been entered into the state database posthumously when new collection laws expanded the DNA system. Meanwhile, the Henderson evidence had gathered dust for decades in a climate-controlled vault, until 2023, when Illinois launched a sweeping cold case initiative. Thousands of old samples were re-examined with cutting-edge extraction methods that could recover genetic traces from fibers, fabric fragments, and even microscopic residues that older technology had simply missed. She opened Sarah's file. The system lagged, each photo loading in jagged, pixelated increments until finally, a young girl's face came into view. Black and white, softly lit. Sarah Henderson, 16, bright eyes, straight brown hair, a smile caught between childhood and the cusp of becoming someone new. A junior at Millbrook High. Honor roll student. Daughter of wheat farmers, Margaret and Robert Henderson. Amy stared at the image longer than she meant to. The girl seemed almost alive in the grayscale stillness of the photograph. According to the report, Sarah had vanished on a Tuesday morning, riding her bicycle along the same quiet dirt road she'd traveled every school day for 3 years. And somewhere along that familiar stretch between her family's wheat fields and the brick facade of Millbrook High, she had simply disappeared. Would you like me to continue this scene, perhaps into Amy's emotional reaction, or her first investigative steps after discovering the match? If you're following this investigation and want to witness how cutting-edge forensic science is rewriting the history of crime solving, turning the impossible into the inevitable, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. What's unfolding here isn't just a story about technology. It's about redemption, persistence, and the ghosts of the past finally finding their voices through modern science. These breakthroughs aren't only solving cases, they're reshaping everything we thought we knew about time, truth, and justice. The original Henderson investigation file was thicker than most from that era, nearly 4 inches of yellowed paper, brittle photographs, and hand-typed reports. It was a time capsule of 1968 detective work, each page carrying the scent of old ink and cigarette smoke. Sheriff Douglas Walsh, the lead investigator back then, had been methodical, perhaps even ahead of his time. By the standards of that era, his attention to detail bordered on obsessive. But he was working with the crude instruments of his generation: intuition, shoe leather, and luck. There were no digital traces to follow, no phone pings to triangulate movement, no surveillance cameras on street corners, no text messages revealing hidden lives. Just human memory, handwritten statements, and the physical evidence he could see, touch, or photograph. Detective Amy Rodriguez scrolled through the digitized inventory list, her eyes tracing the uneven ink marks from a manual typewriter, a relic of an age when every report was struck with physical force onto paper. Item 7. Female sweater, blue cardigan, torn at left shoulder. Unknown fiber samples collected. Item 8. Fabric fragments. Location northwest corner of Bramwell Road and County Line 4. Collected in evidence bags 8A through 8D. The details were ordinary enough, almost unremarkable. But what caught Amy's attention wasn't what Sheriff Walsh had found. It was what he couldn't have possibly known. Those unknown fiber samples were far more than threads of clothing. Embedded within them were fragments of genetic code, microscopic whispers of life that would remain silent for another 25 years. The fabric fragments, too, contained the faintest traces of skin cells, molecules carrying the story of what had truly happened on that lonely stretch of road. But in 1968, such evidence was invisible, unreadable. The science to unlock it didn't yet exist. It would take half a century and a revolution in DNA analysis before those forgotten fibers could finally speak. Amy leaned closer to her monitor, imagining the original investigators cataloging the evidence by hand, unaware that they were preserving the key to a mystery that would outlive them all. And then the story shifted back to that Tuesday morning in 1968. Margaret Henderson awoke to the rhythmic creak of floorboards and the muted sound of her husband's boots crossing the kitchen linoleum below. Dawn was just beginning to spill across the fields, casting soft gold over the ripening wheat. The September air that drifted through the open bedroom window carried with it the earthy scent of harvest and turning leaves, a smell that, for years afterward, would bring Margaret to tears. Their farmhouse stood 3 miles east of Millbrook, on a stretch of gravel road the locals had long since renamed Henderson Road. The driveway wound like a ribbon through the fields, flanked by tall oak trees planted by Robert Henderson's grandfather in 1923. On most mornings, this quiet rhythm of rural life was comforting, a promise that the world was still safe and familiar. But not that morning. Every moment from that day would later be dissected, replayed, and remembered in haunting detail, the way ordinary life always is when it becomes evidence. Margaret recalled Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, shoulders slightly slumped, picking at her breakfast. Bacon and scrambled eggs, prepared just as she liked, sat cooling on her plate. 16 years old, Sarah had begun to carry a kind of reflective stillness, the quiet sensitivity that marks the uncertain crossing between adolescence and adulthood. Not sadness exactly, but thoughtfulness, like Sarah was holding a secret she hadn't decided whether to share. She remembered how her daughter had pushed her plate away, slung her school bag over one shoulder, and smiled faintly before leaving. "I'll see you after class," Sarah had said. The screen door had creaked open, then shut softly behind her. It was the last sound Margaret Henderson would ever hear from her daughter. "Would you like me to continue the next section?" With a moment, Sarah disappears and how the first search begins. She wore her favorite blue cardigan over a white blouse, the same outfit she had chosen for school pictures a previous week. The bicycle ride to Millbrook High School should have taken Sarah exactly 18 minutes. She had timed it herself during her freshman year, pedaling the winding rural route that connected their farm to the small town center, where the school sat adjacent to the grain elevator and the Lutheran church. The route took her along Henderson Road to the intersection with Bramwell Road, then southwest for 2 miles before turning north on County Line 4. It was a journey she had made hundreds of times, through spring rains and winter snow, past the Morrison farm with its red barn that needed painting, beyond the old Carlisle property with its collapsed silo, and finally into town where the trees gave way to sidewalks and the rural silence yielded to the sounds of small-town morning routines. Robert Henderson kissed his daughter goodbye at 7 a.m., noting the time because he had been listening to the Grain Futures report on WLS radio. Sarah wheeled her bicycle, a blue Schwinn Breeze that her parents had given her for her 15th birthday, from the garage where it was stored each night. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Sarah pedaled down the long driveway, her blonde hair catching the early morning sunlight. That image would become Margaret's most treasured and most torturous memory, her daughter disappearing around a bend in the oak line driveway, one hand raised in a casual wave, completely unaware that she was riding toward an encounter that would define the rest of her short life. The first indication that something was wrong came at 8 a.m. when Sarah's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Patricia Dobson, marked her absent. Sarah had missed only 3 days of school in her entire academic career, all due to documented illnesses, and had never been late without prior notification. When Sarah failed to appear for second period English, Mrs. Dobson called the main office by 10 a.m. Principal William Fraser had called the Henderson farm. Margaret answered the phone while kneading bread dough, flour still coating her hands. When she learned that her daughter had never arrived at school, the bicycle was discovered at 11:47 a.m. by Dale Morrison, whose farm bordered the route Sarah took to school. Morrison had been checking fence lines along Bramwell Road when he spotted the blue Schwinn lying on its side in the tall grass near the intersection with County Line 4. The bicycle was undamaged, its chain properly engaged, its tires properly inflated. Sarah's school books remained neatly arranged in the wire basket attached to the handlebars. Algebra textbook, English literature anthology, spiral notebook with her neat cursive handwriting visible through the metal mesh. Her lunch, packed by Margaret in a brown paper bag, sat beside the books. The apple was still crisp, the sandwich still fresh enough that it could have been placed there minutes earlier. Sheriff Douglas Walsh had been preparing for retirement when Sarah Henderson disappeared. At 58 years old, he had spent 32 years maintaining law and order in McLean County's rural communities, dealing primarily with property disputes, occasional domestic disturbances, and the predictable troubles that came with farming communities and seasonal workers. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for a missing child case, especially not one that would quickly escalate beyond the capabilities of his small department. The initial search began within hours of Dale Morrison's discovery of Sarah's abandoned bicycle. Walsh assembled every available resource in McLean County, his 3 full-time deputies, the volunteer fire department, and the civil defense volunteers who typically assisted during tornado seasons and flooding emergencies. By 2 p.m. on September 12th, nearly 60 people were combing the area around Bramwell Road and County Line 4, working in systematic grid patterns that Walsh had learned during his brief military service in Korea. The terrain made searching both easier and more challenging than urban investigations. The flat farmland offered clear sight lines for miles, but the late summer corn stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating a maze of narrow pathways where a person could disappear just yards from the main road. The searchers called Sarah's name continuously, their voices carrying across the September afternoon air, mixing with the sounds of rustling cornstalks and the distant rumble of harvest equipment. Margaret Henderson insisted on joining the search despite Walsh's gentle suggestions that she remain at home near the telephone. Her anguished calls for her daughter created a haunting soundtrack that would remain in searchers' memories for decades. As the sun began to set on that first day, Walsh made the decision to contact the Illinois State Police. The case had moved beyond his department's capabilities, and he knew that time was critical in missing person investigations. State Police Detective Lieutenant Frank Kowalski arrived from Springfield at 9:30 p.m., bringing with him crime scene technicians and bloodhounds borrowed from the Department of Corrections. The dogs picked up Sarah's scent from her bedroom and followed it along her bicycle route, confirming the path to where the bicycle was found but losing the trail at the intersection where the bike had been discovered. The FBI's involvement came on the 3rd day when Special Agent Richard Barnes opened a federal investigation under the assumption that Sarah might have been transported across state lines. Barnes was a methodical investigator who had worked several kidnapping cases in Chicago, but the rural setting and lack of witnesses presented unique challenges. He established a command post in the Millbrook Fire Station, installing multiple telephone lines and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. The search expanded to include nearly 300 volunteers at its peak, drawing people from surrounding counties who had heard about Sarah's disappearance on radio stations broadcasting from Peoria and Bloomington. Farmers suspended their harvest work to join the effort, using their knowledge of local terrain to guide searches through creek beds, abandoned farm buildings, and wooded areas that outsiders might overlook. The Morrison family provided hot coffee and sandwiches from their kitchen, while the Lutheran Church organized meal rotations for the searchers. Walsh documented everything meticulously, filling out reports in his careful handwriting and photographing potential evidence with the department's aging Polaroid camera. Every discarded cigarette butt, every tire track in the soft earth near the roadside, every piece of torn fabric caught on fence wire was collected and cataloged. Most would prove irrelevant, but Walsh understood that missing details could mean the difference between solving a case and watching it fade into the archives of unsolved mysteries. By the end of September, the intensive search had covered over 40 square miles. The FBI had interviewed more than 200 people, including every male resident between the ages of 16 and 60 within a 10-mile radius of where Sarah's bicycle was found. They had checked the backgrounds of recent parolees, transient workers who had been in the area during harvest season, and anyone with a history of contact with minors. But as October arrived and the corn was harvested, revealing fields that held no trace of Sarah Henderson, the investigation began its inevitable transition from active search to cold case file. Margaret Henderson's obsession began with small rituals that seemed reasonable to a grieving mother. She kept Sarah's bedroom exactly as it had been on September 12, 1968, making the bed each morning with the same yellow bedspread, dusting the collection of ceramic horses on the windowsill, and ensuring that Sarah's homework assignments remained stacked neatly on her desk. The algebra problems that Sarah had completed the night before her disappearance stayed open to page 47, her pencil lying beside the notebook at the exact angle where she had placed it after finishing the last equation. In the first months after Sarah vanished, this preservation felt like hope. Margaret told herself that Sarah would return to find everything waiting for her, that maintaining normality was a form of faith that would somehow call her daughter home. But as 1968 became 1969 and then 1970, the unchanging room transformed from a shrine of hope into a monument to loss. Robert Henderson began sleeping in the guest room, unable to pass Sarah's door each night and see Margaret sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Sarah's favorite sweater and whispering conversations with a daughter who wasn't there to answer. The annual pilgrimage to Sheriff Walsh's office became Margaret's most sacred ritual. Every September 12th, she would dress in her best outfit, drive the 8 miles to the McLean County Sheriff's Department, and file a new missing person report for Sarah Michelle Henderson. The law didn't require annual filings for missing persons cases, but Margaret had convinced herself that constant pressure was the only way to prevent Sarah's case from being forgotten. Walsh, and later his successor, Sheriff James Miller, received these visits with patient compassion, even as the reports became increasingly detailed and somewhat detached from reality. By 1975, Margaret's reports included elaborate theories about Sarah's disappearance that she had developed through extensive correspondence with other families of missing children across the Midwest. She became convinced that a network of criminals was systematically abducting teenage girls from rural areas, transporting them across state lines for purposes she could never articulate but clearly feared. Her letters to the FBI grew more frequent and more desperate, filled with connections she had drawn between Sarah's case and missing person reports from Iowa, Indiana, and Wisconsin that shared only the most superficial similarities. The psychological toll on the Henderson family became evident to their rural community in ways that no one quite knew how to address. Robert Henderson, a man who had been known for his steady reliability and gentle humor, became increasingly withdrawn and began drinking heavily after finishing his daily farm work. Their marriage, which had been solid and affectionate before Sarah's disappearance, became a careful choreography of two people trying to grieve in the same house without acknowledging that their grief had taken incompatible forms. Margaret's obsession expanded beyond the annual reports to include maintaining detailed correspondence with psychics, private investigators who promised results for money the Hendersons couldn't afford, and amateur detectives who contacted her after reading about Sarah's case in true crime magazines. She converted Sarah's room into an informal command center, covering the walls with maps marked with pins indicating where other girls had disappeared, timelines written in her increasingly erratic handwriting, and photographs of men who'd been arrested for similar crimes in other states. The community's initial sympathy gradually gave way to uncomfortable avoidance. Margaret's behavior at church services became unpredictable, sometimes involving tearful outbursts during prayers for the sick and other times manifesting as inappropriate laughter during serious moments when her mind had wandered to some memory of Sarah. The women's auxiliary stopped including her in social functions, not out of cruelty, but because her presence transformed every gathering into an occasion for discussing theories about Sarah's disappearance that had become increasingly disconnected from evidence or logic. Robert Henderson died of a heart attack in 1987, found by Margaret in the barn where he had been working alone on equipment maintenance. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but everyone in Millbrook understood that Robert had been dying slowly for 19 years. Worn down by grief and Margaret's refusal to accept that Sarah was never coming home. Margaret discovered his body at noon on a Tuesday, exactly 19 years and 2 months after Sarah had failed to return from school on another Tuesday morning. Detective Patricia O'Brien discovered the forgotten evidence box on a humid Thursday afternoon in August 1995, 27 years after Sarah Henderson's disappearance. O'Brien had been assigned to conduct an inventory of McLean County Courthouse basement storage areas as part of a county-wide effort to digitize old records and clear space for new filing systems. The basement stretched beneath the entire courthouse building, a maze of concrete-walled rooms that had accumulated decades of legal documents, evidence boxes, and administrative files that no one quite remembered how to categorize. The Henderson case file sat in a cardboard banker's box that had been misfiled in a section designated for civil court records rather than criminal investigations. The box itself showed signs of water damage from a pipe leak that had occurred sometime in the 1980s, leaving brown stains along the edges and a musty smell that indicated prolonged moisture exposure. O'Brien nearly overlooked it entirely, mistaking it for another container of property deed transfers or estate probate documents that filled most of the surrounding shelves. When O'Brien finally opened the box, she found herself looking at a case that predated her law enforcement career by nearly a decade. The original evidence inventory, typed on yellowed paper with a manual typewriter whose key struck slightly higher than the other letters, listed 37 items collected during the initial investigation. Most were routine materials that had yielded no useful information: soil samples from the roadside where Sarah's bicycle was found, photographs of tire tracks that proved too degraded to match, witness statements that had led nowhere productive. But buried beneath layers of routine evidence bags and faded photographs was something that made O'Brien pause in the stifling basement air. Evidence bag number 7 contained Sarah Henderson's blue cardigan sweater, the one she had been wearing when she left home on September 12, 1968. The sweater had been torn at the left shoulder, with the fabric separated along a seam in a way that suggested sudden, forceful contact rather than gradual wear. The fiber samples had been collected by FBI technician Robert Chin, whose meticulous evidence collection methods had been noted throughout the original case file. Chin had used tweezers to remove fibers from the torn section of Sarah's sweater that appeared inconsistent with the sweater's own material composition. Under the magnification available in 1968, these fibers appeared to be cotton-based fabric in a dark blue or black color, possibly from work clothing or heavy outerwear. But the technology to analyze these samples properly simply hadn't existed when they were collected. O'Brien found herself staring at evidence that had been waiting nearly 3 decades for forensic science to catch up with investigative theory. DNA analysis had become standard procedure in criminal investigations by 1995, but the techniques for extracting genetic material from fabric fibers were still evolving rapidly. The Illinois State Crime Laboratory had recently acquired equipment capable of analyzing microscopic biological samples that would have been useless to earlier forensic methods. The fabric fragments told a more complex story. Chen had collected these pieces from the ground near where Sarah's bicycle was discovered, some caught on fence wire and others embedded in the gravel shoulder of County Line 4. The fragments appeared to come from at least 2 different sources: pieces that matched Sarah's white school blouse and several pieces that clearly came from different garments entirely. One fragment, barely larger than a postage stamp, showed what appeared to be a small tear pattern with microscopic traces of what Chin had described as possible biological material. O'Brien carefully photographed each piece of evidence before resealing the containers according to updated chain of custody protocols. The basement storage had not been ideal for preserving biological evidence, but the cool, dry conditions had actually helped prevent the degradation that might have occurred in less controlled environments. She could feel the weight of possibility as she carried the box upstairs to her office, understanding that these forgotten fragments might contain the key to answering questions that had tormented the Henderson family for more than a quarter-century. Michael Henderson was 8 years old when his sister Sarah disappeared, young enough that his memories of her were filtered through the lens of childhood hero worship rather than the complex understanding that comes with shared adolescence. By 2019, when her mother Margaret finally succumbed to the combination of emphysema and what the death certificate diplomatically termed complications of chronic grief, Michael had spent 51 years living in the shadow of a sister who had become more myth than memory in their family's daily existence. Margaret's death came on a February morning when the Illinois countryside was locked in the grip of a winter that had lasted since December, with no sign of yielding to spring. Michael found her in Sarah's bedroom, where she had taken to sleeping during her final months, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 5 decades of obsessive investigation. The room had evolved from a preserved shrine into something resembling a conspiracy theorist command center, with walls covered in maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten timelines that traced connections between Sarah's disappearance and dozens of other missing person cases across the Midwest. The funeral was small, attended by the handful of Millbrook residents who remembered the Henderson family from before they became defined entirely by tragedy. Michael stood beside the grave in the Lutheran cemetery where his father Robert had been buried 32 years earlier, listening to Pastor Williams deliver a eulogy that struggled to find words for a woman whose life had effectively ended on the same September day that claimed her daughter. The pastor spoke about Margaret's devotion and persistence, carefully avoiding any direct reference to the mental deterioration that had made her final years a source of discomfort for the community that had once embraced her family. After the funeral, Michael faced the overwhelming task of sorting through Margaret's accumulated materials. The house had become a repository for every document, photograph, and piece of correspondence related to Sarah's case, organized according to a system that made sense only to Margaret's increasingly fragmented thinking. Boxes filled the basement, containing copies of police reports, letters to and from FBI agents, communications with psychics and private investigators, and detailed notes about television programs that had featured missing person cases with any superficial similarity to Sarah's disappearance. But buried within Margaret's obsessive documentation, Michael discovered evidence of genuine investigative work that had been dismissed or overlooked by law enforcement agencies overwhelmed by her more erratic theories. Margaret had maintained correspondence with families of missing girls across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, creating a network of shared information that revealed patterns no single jurisdiction had been able to recognize. Her maps showed clusters of disappearances that occurred during specific time periods in rural areas served by similar highway routes, suggesting the possibility of a mobile perpetrator who had never been identified because the crimes crossed multiple jurisdictional boundaries. Michael had inherited his mother's determination, but possessed the emotional stability that 50 years of grief had gradually eroded in Margaret. He approached Sarah's case with a methodical mindset of someone who had spent his career in agricultural equipment sales, understanding that solving complex problems required systematic analysis rather than intuitive leaps. He began by digitizing Margaret's entire collection, scanning thousands of documents and photographs into a computer database that would allow him to search for patterns and connections that might have been invisible when scattered across physical files. The breakthrough came when Michael contacted Detective Patricia O'Brien, now retired but still consulting on cold cases for the Illinois State Police. O'Brien had kept the Henderson case file active in her mind even after leaving law enforcement, occasionally revisiting the evidence when new forensic techniques became available. When Michael explained his systematic approach to organizing his mother's research, O'Brien realized that the combination of Margaret's investigative work and modern DNA analysis might finally provide the answers that had eluded investigators for more than 50 years. Michael's persistence differed from his mother's in crucial ways. Where Margaret had been driven by desperate hope and increasingly irrational theories, Michael was motivated by a desire to honor both his sister's memory and his mother's lifelong dedication. He understood that solving Sarah's case wouldn't bring either of them back, but he also recognized that allowing the investigation to die with Margaret would mean that their suffering had served no purpose. If you've been following this decades-long search for truth, consider subscribing to see how new forensic methods are finally providing answers to questions that have haunted families like the Hendersons for generations. Detective Amy Rodriguez received the phone call from the Illinois State Crime Laboratory at 3:17 p.m. on November 15, 2023, 55 years and 2 months after Sarah Henderson had failed to arrive at school. Rodriguez had been working the Henderson case intermittently for 8 months, ever since Michael Henderson's persistent advocacy had convinced her supervisor to authorize the expensive genetic genealogy analysis that might finally identify the unknown DNA profile extracted from Sarah's torn sweater. The laboratory technician, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words would reshape decades of unanswered questions. The genetic material recovered from the fabric fragments had yielded a partial but usable DNA profile that had been run through the combined DNA index system with no matches. But the newer technique of forensic genetic genealogy, which compared crime scene DNA to publicly available genetic databases used by ancestry research companies, had produced something unprecedented in the Henderson case, a family tree that led to a specific individual. Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken as Dr. Walsh explained the methodology. The DNA profile had been uploaded to GeneMatch, a public database where people who had taken commercial ancestry tests could share the genetic information to find relatives. The system had identified several distant cousins whose family trees, when analyzed by genetic genealogist Caroline Mitchell, converge on a common set of ancestors in central Illinois during the 1800s. Mitchell had spent 6 weeks constructing detailed family trees for each branch, working backward through birth records, marriage certificates, and census data to identify living descendants who could have contributed the DNA found on Sarah's sweater. The family tree analysis had narrowed the possibilities to 3 men who would have been between 18 and 35 years old in 1968 and living within 50 miles of Millbrook. 2 of these men were still alive and had voluntarily provided DNA samples that eliminated them as matches. The third was Thomas James Carlisle, who had died of liver failure in 2018 at the age of 72. Carlisle's DNA profile, collected during a 2016 arrest for domestic violence, had been entered into CODIS posthumously when Illinois expanded its database inclusion criteria in 2019. Rodriguez stared at the case file that Dr. Walsh had transmitted electronically, reading details about a man who had lived his entire life within 2 counties of where Sarah Henderson disappeared. Thomas Carlisle had been born in 1946 in nearby Ford County, making him 22 years old when Sarah vanished. His criminal record showed a pattern of increasingly serious offenses that began with minor theft charges in his teens and escalated to assault and domestic violence convictions throughout his adult life. Most significantly, Carlisle had been arrested twice for what the reports termed unwanted contact with minors, though both cases had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence and reluctant witnesses. The address history in Carlisle's file revealed something that made Rodriguez's hands shake slightly as she turned the pages. In September 1968, Thomas Carlisle had been living on a family property located on rural Route 7, less than 3 miles from the intersection where Sarah's bicycle was found abandoned. The property, originally owned by his grandfather, Herman Carlisle, was a 40-acre farm that had been gradually subdivided and sold off as the family's agricultural operations declined through the 1960s. Thomas had inherited the main farmhouse and surrounding acreage when his grandfather died in 1967, giving him complete privacy and isolation during the exact time period when Sarah Henderson disappeared. Rodriguez immediately contacted the Ford County Sheriff's Department to request all available records related to Thomas Carlisle and his property. What she learned made her understand why the original investigation had never identified him as a suspect. Carlisle had been questioned briefly in October 1968 as part of the routine canvassing of area residents, but the interview had been conducted by a single deputy who found nothing suspicious about the young man, who claimed to have been working on farm equipment maintenance during the morning of September 12. No follow-up investigation was conducted, and Carlisle's name appeared only once in the thousands of pages of documentation generated during the massive search effort. The investigation into Thomas Carlisle's background revealed a pattern of violence against women that had been hidden for decades behind the protective silence of small-town communities and the limitations of pre-digital record-keeping. Detective Rodriguez spent 3 weeks in November 2023 traveling between county courthouses, police departments, and newspaper archives across central Illinois, piecing together a criminal history that no single jurisdiction had been able to see in its entirety. Carlisle's first documented assault against a female occurred in 1969, less than a year after Sarah Henderson's disappearance. Lisa Morrison, then 19 years old and working as a waitress in the nearby town of Gibson City, had reported that a man matching Carlisle's description had followed her home from work on multiple occasions before attacking her in the parking lot of her apartment building. Morrison's description of her attacker included specific details about a scar on his left hand from a farming accident that matched medical records for Thomas Carlisle. But the investigation had been closed when Morrison suddenly moved to Chicago and refused to cooperate further with police. The pattern continued through the 1970s and 1980s with remarkable consistency. Rodriguez discovered reports from DeWitt County, McLean County, and Champaign County describing similar incidents. Young women who reported being stalked and attacked by a man who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost in the rural areas between small towns. The attacks typically occurred along isolated roads during evening hours, and the perpetrator invariably fled when victims resisted or when other vehicles approached. Most disturbing was the age range of the victims. All were between 15 and 19 years old. All had blonde or light brown hair similar to Sarah Henderson's, and all were traveling alone when they were targeted, whose father had been the state police detective assigned to Sarah's original case. The younger Kowalski had inherited his father's case files when the elder detective died in 2009 and had maintained them in his basement as an unofficial cold case archive. Among these files was a folder labeled Similar Incidents, Unconfirmed Connection, that contained reports his father had collected but never formally investigated due to jurisdictional limitations and resource constraints. The folder contained detailed notes about Thomas Carlisle that had never been included in the official Henderson case file. Detective Frank Kowalski Sr. had become suspicious of Carlisle in 1971 when a pattern of attacks in the area led him to re-examine the list of men who had been questioned during the original investigation. Kowalski had conducted surveillance of Carlisle's property on several occasions and had documented observations about his behavior that suggested potential involvement in multiple crimes against young women. However, the surveillance had been unofficial and had never produced evidence sufficient for an arrest warrant. The most significant discovery came when Rodriguez obtained permission to search the Carlisle property, which had been inherited by Thomas's son, David, after his death in 2018. David Carlisle, who lived in Springfield and used the family property only for weekend hunting, granted permission for a complete search after learning about the DNA evidence connecting his father to Sarah Henderson's disappearance. He had always suspected that his father was capable of violence, having witnessed his brutal treatment of David's mother throughout his childhood, but had never imagined the scope of Thomas's crimes. The search of the Carlisle property began on December 4, 2023, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs that had not been available to investigators in 1968. The main house had been demolished by David Carlisle in 2020, but the foundation and surrounding grounds yielded evidence that painted a horrifying picture of Thomas Carlisle's activities. Buried beneath what had been the basement floor, searchers discovered a metal toolbox containing items that could only be described as trophies, pieces of clothing, jewelry, and personal items that matched descriptions of belongings taken from multiple victims across several decades. Among these items was a small ceramic horse, part of a collection that Margaret Henderson had described to investigators as Sarah's most prized possessions. The horse matched photographs from Sarah's bedroom that had been taken during the original investigation, providing physical evidence that connected Thomas Carlisle not only to Sarah's DNA but to her actual presence at his property. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team and provided Michael Henderson with the first concrete proof that his sister's case was finally approaching resolution. The evidence against Thomas Carlisle became overwhelming during the winter of 2023, but the finality of his death 6 years earlier meant that the traditional concept of justice would never be fully realized. Detective Rodriguez found herself in the peculiar position of building an airtight case against a man who would never stand trial, never face his victims' families in court, and never be forced to account for the decades of suffering he had inflicted on the communities surrounding Millbrook. The forensic analysis of items recovered from Carlisle's property revealed connections to at least 7 other missing person cases spanning from 1969 to 1987. DNA evidence linked Carlisle definitively to 3 of these cases, while personal belongings found in his buried collection provided circumstantial evidence connecting him to several others. The ceramic horse from Sarah Henderson's collection was just one piece in a macabre treasure trove that included a high school class ring belonging to Jennifer Walsh, who had disappeared from Champaign County in 1974, and a distinctive silver bracelet that had belonged to Maria Santos, the 17-year-old who vanished while walking home from her job at a Bloomington restaurant in 1981. Rodriguez spent countless hours reviewing the original investigation files from these related cases, understanding now why the crimes had never been connected during the years when Carlisle was actively preying on young women. The jurisdictional boundaries that separated McLean County from Ford County, DeWitt County, and Champaign County had created investigative silos that prevented law enforcement agencies from recognizing the pattern of a single predator moving systematically through rural Illinois. Each case had been worked independently by dedicated investigators who lacked the communication networks and database systems that would have revealed the connections between Carlisle's crimes. The most devastating revelation came when Rodriguez discovered how close the original investigation had come to identifying Carlisle as Sarah Henderson's killer. In November 1968, Detective Frank Kowalski Sr. had obtained a warrant to search Carlisle's property based on witness reports that placed Carlisle's pickup truck in the vicinity of County Line 4 during the morning hours when Sarah had disappeared. However, the search had been delayed for 2 weeks due to administrative complications, giving Carlisle sufficient time to remove any obvious evidence from his property. The search, when it finally occurred in December 1968, had focused on the house and immediate grounds but had not extended to the areas where evidence was ultimately discovered in 2023. The ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dog capabilities that revealed Carlisle's buried cache of victims' belongings simply hadn't existed 55 years earlier. Additionally, the search warrant had been limited in scope, authorizing investigation only for evidence directly related to Sarah Henderson's disappearance, rather than the broader pattern of crimes that Carlisle had been committing. Rodriguez learned that Detective Kowalski had maintained unofficial surveillance of Carlisle through the early 1970s, documenting his movements and noting correlations between Carlisle's activities and the timing of attacks on young women in the region. Kowalski's personal notes, discovered in his son's basement archives, revealed a level of suspicion about Carlisle that had never been formally documented due to the limitations of evidence collection and legal procedures available at the time. The case files also revealed the tragic irony that Carlisle's criminal activity had actually escalated after he successfully avoided detection for Sarah's murder. The confidence gained from evading the massive investigation into Sarah's disappearance had apparently convinced Carlisle that he could continue attacking young women without consequence. His subsequent victims had paid the price for the investigative limitations that had allowed him to remain free after killing Sarah Henderson. By January 2024, Rodriguez had assembled sufficient evidence to close 8 separate cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The McLean County State's attorney formally declared that Thomas Carlisle would have been charged with first-degree murder in Sarah Henderson's death if he had been alive to face prosecution. Similar declarations were issued by prosecutors in the 4 other counties where Carlisle's crimes had occurred, providing official recognition of his guilt even though traditional justice was impossible. Michael Henderson received the call from Detective Rodriguez on January 18, 2024, exactly 55 years and 4 months after his 8-year-old world had been shattered by his sister's disappearance. He was working in his home office in Springfield, reviewing agricultural equipment sales reports for the previous quarter, when his cell phone rang with the news that would finally close the longest chapter of his family's tormented history. Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of both triumph and tragedy as she explained that the Illinois State Police had officially closed Sarah Henderson's missing person case. The DNA evidence combined with the discovery of Sarah's ceramic horse among Carlisle's hidden collection provided conclusive proof that Thomas Carlile had abducted and murdered Sarah on September 12, 1968. Rodriguez spoke carefully, understanding that the word she was choosing would become Michael's permanent memory of the moment when 55 years of questions finally received their answers. The news brought Michael a complex mixture of relief, grief, and anger that he struggled to process. Relief that the uncertainty was finally over, that his mother's lifelong obsession had been vindicated, and that Sarah's memory could be honored with truth rather than speculation. Grief for the sister he had lost and for the parents who had died without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Anger at the decades of suffering that could have been prevented if the original investigation had been able to connect the evidence that ultimately solved the case. Rodriguez arranged for Michael to view the evidence that had been recovered from Carlisle's property, understanding that seeing Sarah's ceramic horse would provide a tangible connection to his sister that he had been missing for more than 5 decades. The viewing took place in a conference room at the Illinois State Police headquarters in Springfield, where Michael sat across from Detective Rodriguez and carefully examined the small ceramic figure that had once stood on Sarah's bedroom windowsill. The horse was a Palomino mare, painted in shades of cream and gold that had faded slightly during its decades of burial, but remained recognizable as one of the collection that Sarah had treasured. Michael remembered the day his parents had given Sarah the complete set for her 14th birthday and how she had arranged them carefully on her windowsill, where the morning sunlight would make them seem to glow. Holding the recovered horse in his hands, Michael felt connected to his sister in a way that had been impossible when she existed only in memory and faded photographs. The formal closure of Sarah Henderson's case brought an end to one of the longest, quietest chapters in Millbrook's history, and for her brother Michael, it marked the beginning of something both heartbreaking and healing. For 55.5 years, his sister's name had lingered in the community like a whisper, carried in old newspaper clippings and fading memories. But now, with the truth finally known and justice secured, he could do what had once seemed impossible: lay her to rest. The memorial service took place on March 15, 2024, inside the modest white-steepled Millbrook Lutheran Church. The sanctuary, though small, was filled to its wooden rafters. Rows of aging pews held neighbors who had known the Henderson family, retired officers who had joined the search back in 1968, and younger faces who had grown up hearing fragments of the story passed down like a local legend. The late winter sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting soft blues and golds across the faces of those who came to say goodbye to a girl who had vanished before most of them were even born, but whose absence had left an indelible mark on their town. When Michael rose to speak, the murmur in the room fell away into reverent silence. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he began to talk. Not about grief, but about persistence, about how science and faith sometimes work together to bring light into the darkest corners of the past. He spoke of Detective Amy Rodriguez and the Illinois State Police, whose dedication had transformed decades of unanswered questions into closure. He thanked the townspeople who had refused to forget, who still lit candles every September, who still told their children about the girl who never came home. Then Michael made an announcement that drew quiet tears from nearly everyone present. In Sarah's memory, he had founded the Sarah Henderson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting families of missing persons in rural communities and strengthening communication between law enforcement agencies. Using the insurance settlement that had come after officially confirming Sarah's death, the foundation would fund training programs for small-town officers, giving them access to the forensic tools and interjurisdictional networks that could one day prevent other families from enduring what has had. Later, under a sky streaked with pale spring light, Michael stood beside his sister's new memorial marker in the Millbrook Lutheran Cemetery. It had been placed between the graves of their parents, Margaret and Robert, whose lives had quietly unraveled under the weight of not knowing. The earth beneath his feet was cool, firm, and still. For the first time, there were no more questions to ask, no more waiting for a phone call that would never come. As the wind moved gently through the oaks lining the cemetery, Michael felt something inside him loosen, a pressure that had lived in his chest for half a century. The mystery that had haunted his family's name was finally over. Sarah could rest now, and so could they. Firm and still. For the first time, there were no more questions to ask, no more waiting for a phone call that would never come. As the wind moved gently through the oaks lining the cemetery, Michael felt something inside him loosen, a pressure that had lived in his chest for half a century. The mystery that had haunted his family's name was finally over. Sarah could rest now, and so could they. Would you like me to continue this narrative with a closing reflection, perhaps from Detective Rodriguez's point of view, showing how the case changed her perspective on time and justice?